رحلة طويلة تلك التي خاضها إيبن بارلو من ضابط عمليات خاصة في الجيش الجنوب أفريقي في زمن الفصل العنصري إلى توليه قيادة مكتب التعاون المدني، وهو الاسم الحركي للمكتب الإقليمي لمخابرات جنوب أفريقيا في أوروبا الغربية، وذلك قبل إقالته في نهاية الثمانينيات لرفضه تنفيذ الأوامر بتصفية أحد سود جنوب أفريقيا في المنفى. بعد إقالته أسس بارلو أول شركة جيش خاص في العالم ليقوم بتسجيل نجاحات لافتة للنظر لإخماد حركات تمرد عديدة في أفريقيا ضد الحكومات الشرعية، ومن بينها سيراليون وأنغولا ونيجيريا. وبالرغم من أنه لا قيادات هذه الشركات ولا عناصرها يتحدثون إلى وسائل الإعلام، إلا أن إيبن بارلو اختص الجزيرة نت بهذا الحديث الحصري الذي كشف خلاله العديد من الأسرار.
Mr. Eeben Barlow, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
My pleasure, sir.
As a private military company, aka PMC, Executive Outcomes operated in various conflict zones. How does your experience in these areas shape your view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
I think it's very difficult. We're looking at two vastly different situations. And, one cannot take a template for Africa and sort of superimpose it on the Middle East or on the conflict between Israel and Gaza. So I think we're looking at very different things. We do, however, follow what's happening because that's how we learn and try and understand behind what's everything behind this conflict.
BMCs often work for state players. What do you think if a BMC accepted a contract from Israel to be part of its war against the Palestinians?
I think it's always a difficult situation. I know, speaking from where I come from Africa, and my company, Executive Outcomes, we do not engage ourselves in conflicts where we do not understand the terrain, first of all, the languages of the people, the different cultures, the ethnic groups, the religions, etc. So any PMC accepting a contract there ought to understand these things if they are to make any positive impact on either side.
South Africa has made a strong case at the ICJ against the genocide committed by Israel against the Palestinians over the last year. Do you agree on your country's decision, and how do you define genocide and ethnic cleansing in a military context?
Well, first of all, I think governments make decisions and the voters fall in line with the decisions that are made. So, of course, you're going to find people in South Africa that are very against the fact that the government made a case at the ICJ, and you're going to get people who applaud it. However, my view is that before we start looking at trying to resolve other people's problems and issues, we should look at what's happening at home. And then secondly, to show that we are that we stand for humanitarian aspects. We never condemned the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And I therefore think that, if we're going to condemn one or look at one specifically, we should also look at the other and not be selective in who we try and approach the ICJ with.
In light of the fact that more than 45,000 Palestinians killed, mostly civilians, by Israel in the last 12 months, how do you think honorable militaries should conduct themselves in urban and heavily civilian populated areas?
Well, I think urban and heavily populated or densely populated areas create their own problems for any military force because there is going to be collateral damage. So unless operations are planned and executed as surgically as possible, there's going to be problems. However, we believe that we stay out of urban areas because of the collateral damage, i.e. the civilian casualties that occur, as well as the immense damage that's just done to all parties involved in this. If military forces go into an urban environment, there is the military approach of you take block or block by block or house by house, etc. But that's not always possible. So to us, again, coming from where I do, we will try and avoid urban areas, especially densely urban areas.
You just mentioned something about surgical strikes. Do you believe that there's such thing like surgical strikes?
No, I do not actually believe that. Although there have been instances where technology has been used to achieve true surgical strikes. But in general, people love to use it as a buzzword. It was a surgical strike. But there's no consideration for the collateral damage caused in it. And oftentimes I think a surgical strike should actually be defined as a non-surgical strike.
In Africa, you've witnessed many conflicts. Are there any lessons drawn that could be applied in the conflict in the Middle East?
I think Africa is a unique environment, first of all. And people will make a mistake if they try to view Africa through a European lens or through an Israeli lens or through an East Bloc lens. Africa is unique. It has its own circumstances, but there are always lessons to be learned. I think one of the great lessons that has come out of recent wars is the application of UAVs or drones and their role on the battlefield. But of course, even a drone can be neutralized in some ways through electronic warfare, and a drone does not discriminate. So unless you're looking at a FPV drone or a first-person drone, you're not going to achieve a surgical effort with a normal drone. But we always learn lessons.
Having served in the pre-South African Transformation Army, as well as in covert intelligence capacity, what do you think when many people brand Israel as an apartheid state? Do you believe the violence used by the apartheid regime against the black South Africans is comparable to Israel's against Palestinians?
I think that's always a very difficult question to answer because one cannot truly be objective about it, especially when I speak of my own country. If we look at the period of the so-called apartheid era, which ended in 1994, the amount of people that died, according to the Human Research people, is 21,000 in total. And you just mentioned a figure.
How many years?
From 1960, I believe, until 1994. So I believe there's already
20,000.
It said 21,000. So I don't think we can actually draw a comparison between the two. I think when people, apartheid became a buzzword for many, and I think it's often being used in a way to almost position a government on the defensive. However, in the South African situation, it was totally different because it was aimed at petty apartheid, who could go where and do what, and then of course just apartheid as it stood, that black people or people of color were severely disadvantaged in many ways. I don't think we can really correlate between the two.
Do you see a direct analogy between the apartheid system in South Africa and the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians' homeland? And if so, in which way?
No, I don't. First of all, despite what anyone would say, South Africans did not invade South Africa. I mean, South Africa was colonized, yes, but every country in the world has been colonized. And many of us who grew up in Africa view ourselves as Africans or South Africans. We didn't invade anyone. In terms of invade and occupy, of course, we did trans-border operations into Angola. And there were very strict rules in terms of the rules of war and who could be engaged and not be engaged. And I've met many of my old enemies from those days, and we've discussed these. So, you know, we've been able to talk about it and get an understanding of how we experienced the conflicts. But I don't believe there's a direct correlation between the two.
South Africa's apartheid regime was often framed as a defense of Western values. Do you see a similar framing with the Israeli Zionist regime?
I think you have to go back. That is, young South Africans or men of my era, we were brought up in a world where it was a fight between democracy and capitalism and communism and socialism. So in our minds and with what we were taught, we were defending democracy and capitalism. And that is easy to entrench that in youngsters growing up. Yes. I think the so-called Western values that you're referring to refer to that in particular. Yes. and everything that goes along with democracy and capitalism. I don't think that what we're witnessing at the moment is the same in terms of apartheid South Africa and what's currently unfolding in Israel. I think there's vast differences. And in terms of Western values...
But from the outside, they look similar, the same framing. By doing that, they justify its violence.
Well, I think there's two ways and there's two rules in the world at the moment. There's a rule that applies to Africa and parts of the Middle East, and then there's a ruling for the rest of the world. Defending...
You mean double standards?
Absolute double standards, yes. Mm-hmm. South Africa did not go out and occupy areas and build homes there, etc., nor were we subjected to the types of incursions that the opposites of Israel have done. So it's very difficult to really view these through the exact same lens. You cannot do that. But in terms of defending Western values, of course, Israel has people that come from all the European countries that are part of Israel. So in many ways, Israel can lay claim to that, just as what we laid claim to it. But I think that the problem lies way deeper than just defending Western values.
Apartheid was internationally condemned as a crime against humanity. Do you believe that Israel's actions against the Palestinians, including mass civilian killings, warrant the same classification and therefore the same sanctions?
I think the sanctions applied on South Africa were very different from what the world is talking about now. And I'd like to just digress slightly and just say that South Africa was under enormous sanction. It's not the same type of sanction we see on Israel, but we also have to remember that Israel has done a lot in terms of defense development that the West has taken. So there's very much a quid pro quo going on, whereas that wasn't from South Africa. And I believe, and this is just my personal opinion, that it's a hypocritical way of viewing countries, because we were under severe embargo, whereas Israel has not had to face that embargo. They faced the criticism, but not the embargo.
But then again, you're talking about the Israeli defense industry. Actually, it doesn't help that much, because we can see the unimaginable amounts of weapons being dumped from the United States and European countries in Israel to be used against the civilians in Gaza. So the question is, don't you think, based on the fact that the international community classified or described apartheid as a crime against humanity, that judging by the actions of Israel, it deserves the same classifications and the same sanctions?
I think the answer is quite simple. 21,000 people died during the apartheid era from 1960. And you mentioned a figure that was double that. That's happened over a year. So one has to draw your own conclusion as to who has actually done what and who can be classified as what. We as South Africans, and let me also just qualify this, South Africa was in many ways not what the world described it as, or what the world wanted everyone to see South Africa as. And there was this hypocrisy. And it's hypocrisy we witness all over, whether that conflict be in South Africa, in the DRC, in the Sudan, Russia, Ukraine, or Israel and Gaza. So, and that's why I said for everyone there's different rules that apply. Crimes against humanity, that's a question I cannot answer because I do not investigate those issues.
On July 23rd, 1986, at a hearing at the Senate, Joe Biden, head of the Foreign Relations Committee, blasted his government for its inaction regarding what he described the repugnant and disgusting white apartheid regime of South Africa. In his speech, he described his government as lacking the moral backbone and that the favorites of the U.S. must be the black South Africans.
Favorites in South Africa are the people who are being repressed by that ugly white regime. We have favorites. Our loyalty is not to South Africa, it's to South Africans. And the South Africans are majority black.
38 years later, the same Joe Biden stands as the U.S. president squarely behind Israel's genocide against the Palestinians and most recently the Lebanese.
The United States stands with Israel, We will not ever fail to have their back.
Which Joe Biden do you believe?
It's a good question. Which one do you believe? I think it just goes back to what I said earlier. There's hypocrisy in the world. Despite everything that South Africa did that was wrong, and I know it was wrong, and many of my fellow South Africans know it was wrong. And it's not talk we've had since South Africa became an independent state. These are the talks we had while I was still serving in the armed forces. Yes, there were things that were morally reprehensible. But I've seen that discussion of now President Biden. And it is very clear that it is pure hypocrisy, as far as I'm concerned. There were huge efforts made to bring so-called white South Africa to its knees. We don't see that witnessed anywhere else in the world. So why was South Africa attacked?
But in our case, we're talking specifically about the Israelis and what they are doing.
I understand what you say, sir, but the reason is, or the question I ask is, why is the same not being applied in other parts of the world? Why would it be focused only on South Africa? Or is it that in actual fact, South Africa didn't really matter, and that was just a populist chorus or song to sing to get other people to support it? Right now, what we're witnessing is a totally different story as relating to Israel. The US are sending forces to Israel. The British are evacuating citizens. The Middle East is a powder keg waiting to explode. But in those days, South Africa was a powder keg waiting to explode. And no one came to help no one, no matter what they said about helping, whether it be the whites or the blacks. No one deployed their forces to help either party. So, and that's why I say it goes back to international hypocrisy. And that's what I view it as.
The ANC was branded as a terrorist organization by the apartheid regime. Similarly, Palestinian resistance groups are labeled as terrorists by Israel. How do you view these classifications?
Well, first of all, the world has never agreed on a definition for terrorism. And terrorism in its most basic form is, in my opinion, a tactic that's applied to intimidate people, to create fear, and to create a climate in which people will follow those who are practicing this tactic of terror. I think that calling the ANC a terrorist organization, at that time, it suits the narrative. It suits the popular narrative. You know, there's a threat. We as the government have the solution to overcome the threat. And in doing so, you can actually manipulate people and create the perception that government is doing what it can. So I think there's, first of all, that difference between terrorism, and then you also have to consider, when do so-called terrorists actually become partisans? If South Africa is invaded by a foreign force, and I pick up arms to fight that force,
You should be a partisan.
I will be a partisan in my own eyes. But in the eyes of the invader, I'm the terrorist.
Okay, I'm asking you, in your eyes, how do you view the Palestinian resistance groups?
Well, within their own country, I would view them as fighting for what they believe is theirs. Just as I would if we invaded by a foreign invader.
In terms of impunity, which regime, apartheid South Africa or Israel, do you think has received more protection and leniency from the international community?
Very obviously Israel. We were the pariah state of the world, we being South Africa. And then, of course, there were always the talks about transitioning to a different type of government. There were the talks held by foreign governments toward us, but there were mass sanctions applied on us. And we could never escape those sanctions. And those sanctions had a positive spin-off and they had a negative spin-off. But we don't see similar sanctions being applied to, be it Israel or any other country in the world. So I think in terms of leniency, it would definitely be Israel that's getting the most.
Okay, based on that question, which of these two regimes do you believe history will judge more harshly for its treatment of the oppressed?
I think you have to look at agendas. And if you look at agendas and understand the narratives, I'm sure that South Africa will post or pre-democracy in South Africa, we will still be judged harshly. It's almost like at the end of the Second World War, the Germans were judged harshly. South Africa will be judged harshly. And I think within time, Israel is going to become judged very harshly, because we're seeing more and more European resistance to what's unfolding between Israel and Gaza and Lebanon as well. And then of course there's Iran. So I think all of these countries will be judged harshly, but I think in time to come, a greater harshness will be exercised on Israel.
South Africa eventually achieved the negotiated transition towards democracy. Given the severity of Israel's actions, do you think a similar approach is possible in the Middle East for the Palestinians?
I think first of all you have to consider what resulted in South Africa entering into meaningful negotiations. And I think most people realized within South Africa we have more in common than what separates us, apart from skin color. I think Israel is a lot more complex because Israel is a young state. The Palestinians who have self-governance over the strip which everyone refers to as either Palestine or Gaza, I think there the problems are a lot more different. But regardless of it, it's going to have to be a political solution, because you cannot shoot people's ideals and beliefs away. They'll always be there. So it'll have to be political.